Hey everybody and welcome back. I know I've been going a little bit crazy on Kubernetes lately and don't worry, that's not going to stop, but today we're going back to Docker and we're going to be looking at how to deploy Zitadel. So Zitadel is a new player in the identity and access management space and it's making some bold claims, but I've been really impressed with it so far. So it's aiming to go toe-to-toe with things like Keycloak and Authentic and other things that are more open source in nature like Authelia. And it boasts some really cool features off the bat. So in this video, we're going to have a look at some of those features, and I'm then going to show you how to deploy this within Docker, and then how to connect things like Portainer to use single sign-on with Zitadel. Now, for you brave folk who've already moved over to Kubernetes, they do offer a Helm chart for this. So you should be able to follow this process and deploy it using Helm, and you'd still get the same user experience. So let's dive into Zitadel and do a quick feature review before we get into the actual deployment. So looking at the Zitadel website, I was really impressed by how professional it was and also the number of organizations that are seemingly already using this. Plus, I've had a great time on their Discord and a lot of their staff have been really responsive to my questions. So a big thumbs up from that perspective. So just having a quick look through, we can see what the authentication journey can offer us. So there's hosted login, and this is going to give you things like modern authentication methods, single sign-on, and social logins. So that's right, you could use things like your existing Google or Microsoft or GitHub account and actually use that as your identity provider to log into some of your home lab systems. You can also then bolster things on like multi-factor authentication, so you can use biometrics on your mobile phone device. So not only will you be logging in with things like your Microsoft account or just a username and password if you wanted, but you can also bolster that by doing a push notification onto your mobile device. You can also, if you're more in the enterprise space, you can customize your own logging experience, do some branding, etc., which is a really nice touch. On top of that, they do things a bit differently. So they build in things like role-based access control. So you can actually set up roles within Zitadel and then apply those to your applications. So certain users will get certain features and others won't, much like you would have a traditional hierarchy in an application of admins, users, etc. Zitadel is slightly different to things like Keycloak. Instead of having realms, it has the notion of projects. And these projects make it multi-tenanted. So you could have multiple projects in different tenants and architect your setup just like that. There's a whole host of documentation around integrating it into your landscape. This means customizing configurations and creating your own user journeys, bespoke to what you're trying to achieve. Now, with any new project like this, there are gaps in the documentation, as I found out whilst trying to onboard Portainer. But I finally got it working thanks to help within the community. In fact, somebody in my own Discord, so thank you to you. And I do recommend that if you're going to deploy this and spin it up in your home lab, if you do manage to get new applications working with it that aren't already in the existing documentation, please just submit those so they can add it to their repository and let's help them out. So let's dive into the Docker Compose now and let's start getting this set up. So before we get into a config review, I'd just like to point out that you don't have to install this within Docker. You can just do it on binaries on many popular operating systems, so do bear that in mind. Essentially, the Docker Compose version comes down to two options. You can either do it locally, i.e. without certs, or you can do it the proper way like I'm going to show you here, where we're going to route all of these requests through our reverse proxy, so we get the benefits of SSL and valid certificates and green ticks in browsers. You know the drill by now. So in the official documentation, you need to download 3 config files. We'll come on to those in a minute. But the main part of this is getting the Docker Compose file up and running. So if we quickly look here on the left, we can see how this is put together. So we have Zitadel, and we have 2 networks. Now by default, it just goes onto its own Zitadel network. Now remember, this is a network within Docker itself, so it's not exposed. And we need this network because this compose file comprises of 2 containers. It's a multi-container deployment. And it's only Zitadel and CockroachDB. Now, that made me smile as well. I haven't actually heard of CockroachDB. I don't know if I should have done. But it seems like a good fit for what Zitadel are trying to do because of the way it's architected. We'll come on to that in a bit. But on top of that, I've also added our proxy network because we need to specify this to route it through our reverse proxy. So we're simply going to specify an image here, so Zitadel stable. And once we specify the image, we're going to get onto the commands. Now this is the bit that tripped me up to begin with, because there's a few things you need to do before you can spin up this container. It basically needs to take these commands as initial arguments to spin up the application. One of the first things you'll need to do is generate the master key. Now, this probably isn't the most secure way of doing it, because as you can see at the end, I've got the master key in a compose file, and you probably want to reference a file instead, i.e. a secrets file. But for this demonstration, I'm going to keep it really simple, just so you know what I'm doing. So basically, you need to generate this master key here. And to do that, simply run this command on your Linux environment or whatever you're using. When you get that code, you just need to paste it here at the end, the -- master key, and put it in here. The other really important bit to do for a reverse proxy setup is to have this TLS mode external. Now don't worry, I'll have this file on my GitHub as usual, and you can just copy and paste this and tweak it to your desire. The rest of it is pretty straightforward, but there were two environment variables I needed to add, which wasn't clear in the documentation, certainly not in the right place, if that makes sense. So whilst these instructions were on there, they were buried elsewhere in the documentation. So effectively, it does what it says on the tin. It says the first instance is going to set a username and password. Now, you need this for the first instance you log in. Pretty self-explanatory. But make sure you set this to whatever you need to be, and you can always come back to your compose file if you forgot it. It will be asking you to change this password when you first log in, so don't worry if it's weak. Now, I've left the port in here, but you can get rid of this because we're going to be running it through the reverse proxy. I just had it in there to debug, really. Now the next thing we do is specify some volumes. So you can either use the volumes as they recommend, or you could even change these to bind mounts if you want. I've left these just as Docker volume mounts. I normally do bind mounts, but I'm just going to leave it as they recommend for the video. And as you can see, this is simply what we can see here on the right, these three files here, and we'll get onto those in a minute. But it's pretty self-explanatory. The config file is how it's going to configure Zitadel, so when it boots up, what configuration settings it will have. The next one is the secrets, so things like the database password. And then the final one is the initial steps, so the initial commands it's going to take and parameters when it spins this up for the first time. The last bit is the certificates, and it generates some internal certificates that it uses within its application. Next is the labels for traffic, so we can access it through the browser through a URL, and there's nothing different here. However, there is one other important bit that we haven't seen before in my videos, and that is to set the server scheme to H2C. Now that's a special protocol designed for this kind of traffic, so we need to specify H2C, and I'll put a link if you want to go and read a bit more about what that is and why it's important. Actually, there are 3 containers, not 2, my mistake. But this container is ephemeral, and once it's started up, it will shut down and you no longer require it. So this is going to pull down the certificate image for CockroachDB, and it's going to generate the certificates needed for the database and the application. There's nothing you need to do here or change, so just leave that as is. Lastly, we've got CockroachDB. And you'll notice that both of these are only on the Cockroach network. They're not on the proxy, so they're not going to be exposed outside our Docker environment. And again, there's nothing you need to change here. So just leave this as is. It's going to create a database, and it's going to allow Zitadel to connect to this database with the credentials we provide within the config files. At the bottom, we simply create the networks that we require, and we also specify the volumes at the bottom. So pretty straightforward, just there were a few key things that caught me out and took me a while to get this spun up, but hopefully I've taken the sting out of this for you guys. So let's move on to the configuration files themselves. The first one is the config.yaml. So if we look in here, the only thing I've added to the default is this part here, and we need this to make sure that we can access it through our reverse proxy. So it's saying that external secure is true. So that means it's secured externally, not internally, i.e. it's going to use HTTP, but we're going to be doing HTTPS to the proxy. That will terminate the HTTPS, and it will pass it on then to the container itself. We need to specify your external domain, so this will probably be zitadel.yourdomain.com, and we're going to run this on port 443. If you don't get this right, it's going to come up with an instance not found message when you start it up. If you do get that, that's because you haven't set this correctly. So go back and make sure this is right and then spin it up again. Everything else in here I've left as default. I haven't changed anything else, and you don't need to touch anything else to get this to work. So looking into the next file, we've got the initial initiation steps. And this is just to set the first human instance. Now, I don't actually think it needs this because we've specified in the Docker Compose the initial login steps here. So I've just left this because I'm not sure exactly what it does. I think it's redundant, but I'm just going to leave it there for now. Lastly, we've got the actual secrets themselves, and this is used by the database. So please do change these because they're obviously not very secure. And this is then passed on to the Zitadel container, so it has the credentials to access the database. So now going into the terminal, let's deploy this container. So we're going to cd into our Docker Compose folder, and then we're going to run the sudo docker compose up-d command. So when we run that, it's going to go away and pull the containers down, and it's going to set up that temporary ephemeral certificates container. It's going to shut that down once it's generated the certificates, and then those are going to be exposed through that volume to Zitadel and CockroachDB. I did have some issues the first time this ran, and we'll look in the Portainer logs in a moment. The issue was that Zitadel was saying that the database, it couldn't connect to it. And I think it's something to do with the Docker networking not quite being in sync or something like that. But simply restarting the Zitadel container fixed the issue. So let's jump in Portainer now and just check that everything's okay. So over in Portainer, we can see that we've got the certs and it's exited. Just like I said, it's an ephemeral container just used to generate the certificates that are necessary. So we don't need that to be on. So don't worry if it says exited. Let's look at the database. That all looks fine. There's no error messages and it's listening. So that's great. Let's go back now and look at Zitadel and see if I got the error again that I had previously. No, perfect. Before it was complaining up here that it couldn't reach the database. If that does happen, simply restart the container. If that fails, restart both containers. But as you can see here, the console URL should be available on zitadel.jimsgarage.co.uk/UI/console. You don't need to put that in, it should auto direct you to those pages. And if you look at the bottom, it says it's up and listening on port 8080 on all interfaces. Fantastic. So make sure you add a DNS record for this in whatever your resolver is, but I'm going to copy this now into my browser and we'll see if this loads. So pasting this now into the address bar, let's hit return and fingers crossed we should reach the login page. Bingo, there we go. So we now need to log in. So because we created a user, we don't actually need to register, albeit you could register another user. So remember your username and password from your Docker Compose file and simply put the username in here. So for me it was admin1 ! And it's a bit annoying because you need to have some funny characters in your name for security purposes. So hitting next, I need to put my password in. So again, that'll be in your Docker Compose file. So hit next and then we should get into the GUI. So now that you've entered your password, you're greeted with the setup wizard. So you've got a few options here. You can use something like an authenticator for a one-time password, or you could use something like biometrics on your device. That's up to you. I'm not going to set that up in this video, but it's really straightforward, and it'll be the same as any other application that you've ever set this up for. So I'm going to hit skip on this, but feel free to set it up on your device. Now you need to change your password, so put in your old password and then specify a new password. Make sure it meets the complexity obligations at the bottom. And when you're ready, just hit next. And once you specified your password, you should be able to hit next. And then you'll be greeted with the dashboard. There we go. Congratulations, you've got Zitadel now up and running. And we now need to start plugging in our applications. So thankfully there's a really cool wizard. And as you can see, there's 6 steps here that it recommends you complete. I'm not going to go through all of these steps just because things like setting up SMTP is pretty straightforward, but I recommend you do that if you're going to use this externally. But for me, I'm only going to be using this internally, so I don't need to set up SMTP for me. I don't need any more branding I'm already bad enough at that. So what I am going to do is create a project, create an application. I'll look at users, but I'm just going to use the default admin that I created. And I'll also have a look at the grant users. But again, I'm not going to use it because it's just me that's using this at the moment. Maybe in the future, I'll set this up for other people on my network, family, etc. But for now, I'm just going to be using it for myself. So let's create a project. And a project is a bit like we had realms within Keycloak. So for this one, I'm just going to create the project of Home Lab. And within Home Lab, I'm going to specify all of my applications. So for this video, as I mentioned, I'm going to do an application and it's going to be called Portainer. So once you've named it, you've got a few options. Now for Portainer, we need to choose web because it's a web application. But do note that there are other types of application that this will work for, and you can read the documentation on the website to find out what the nuances are and what the use case might be for your application. So for this one, for web, we're going to hit continue. And then again, you get some more confusing vernacular if you're not up to scratch with your identity and access management. Now, I was told repeatedly that PKCE should work with Portainer, but unfortunately it didn't work for me. So the one we need to do for Portainer is code. But do note that there are also things like Java Web Tokens and the good old-fashioned post, which is not recommended for security reasons. So for this, we're going to choose code and we're going to hit next. And then it's going to specify things that are similar to how we did with Keycloak, Authentic, etc. So for this, it's the redirect URIs. So in my instance, it's https portainer.jimsgarage.co.uk. And I also want to be routed back to this whenever I log out of the application. So now that those are both specified, we can hit continue. Then it's given us a quick summary of what we've got here. So I'm then going to click create. Now when I click create, it's going to generate a client ID and the client secret. Now take heed of this notice here. It will disappear when you close this, so do make a copy of this or use it in the application you need. If you do lose this, you're going to have to create this process again and generate a new key. So now that we've got this here, let's head into Portainer and let's set up our authentication. So over in Portainer, I've gone to settings, I've gone to authentication, and I've chosen a custom OAuth provider. And I need to start putting in some values. So this client ID and client secret, those are what are being shown on this screen here. So let's copy the client ID and put that in the client ID field. And then we'll also copy the secret and put that in the secret field. Now, as you can tell, I've cheated and I've done this before, but these are all the endpoints for what we need to connect up to Portainer. Now, don't worry, you don't need to record these on the screen now. You'll be able to see those in a moment in Zitadel. So now we've copied and pasted in there. I'm going to hit save just so they're saved in the application, because remember, after this, we're not going to be able to see this again. So I'm going to click close, and then it's going to take us back now to the summary of the application within the project we just created. And as I said, the important bit are the URLs. So you can click that over here on the left, and you'll get all of the URLs that you need to plug into Portainer so it looks like this. Now the key bits for Portainer are to use the user identifier of email and the scopes of OpenID, profile and email. Once you've put all that in, again, remember to click save and you should be good to go. So let's quickly test that this is now working, and then we'll go back into Zitadel to look at more of the features. So I'm going to test this by going to the top. I'm going to hit admin and I'm going to hit log out. And now once you've logged out, you'll get this button come up that says log in with OAuth, which you'll have seen before if you followed my Keycloak or Authentic videos. So with any luck, I can click login with OAuth and it's going to take me now through that process. It's going to create the user, which should be admin at Zitadel, and we should be back into Portainer with one click. And there we go. Brilliant. As you can see, before I was admin, now I'm admin 1 at Zitadel. So yeah, it worked. Perfect. Now, you'll have noticed when I logged in, I wasn't an administrator. So I've now logged back into my admin account. You can just use the use internal login back on portainer.jimsgarage.co.uk login page. You need to click on the user and then click on the toggle and hit save. So now you have single sign-on set up using Zitadel, which is pretty awesome. So let's head back into Zitadel now and just have a quick run through some of the features and how you might want to use them. So back on the home page, we might want to add some more users. So that's pretty straightforward, and you would just create a new user providing their email address. This is obviously going to be more beneficial if you do set up the SMTP server, because people might want to have features like resetting password links, all those sorts of things, and maybe things like a password recovery, etc. So you can go through this and then spin up a user. So I'm just going to create a generic user. So I set up Jim and I'm going to add him. So Jim should now show up. Now this user hasn't been activated yet because I put in the email address and it was sent an email to my address. So I could go in there and click that. But you can also look through different features here. So you can add multi-factor authentication, registration links. You can even set up things like external identity providers for this user. Now remember, I'm logged in as the admin, so I'll be seeing all of this stuff. Jim isn't set up as an admin, so Jim won't see all of this stuff. And then you can also start to do things like putting them into different membership groups and manager roles. So maybe I would want to make Jim an admin, and I can do that here. The interesting thing then as well is if you go to your projects, so for example the Home Lab, the Zitadel is the default one which houses all of the admin stuff, which you can see here, so the management API, admin API, auth API. But if we go back to the project that I created, the Home Lab, I can now go through roles and grants, and those roles and grants can be done at the user level. So say I've got Jim and maybe I've got Bob and Alice. All of those can have different roles and different grants on a per application basis, which is really quite powerful. So now we've added a user and we've seen what we can do with them in projects. I've gone back to the home page and we can then grant users, which, as it says, it allows users to access your application and set up their role. So if we click on this, we can now select myself as a user and we can add them to a project, so the Home Lab project. So if I hit continue, you can say select the roles that you want. Now we haven't actually created any roles, so we'd need to go and do that first. But once we've created those roles, we can add them here. So let's go back and let's have a look at some of the roles that we can assign people. So to do that, we'd head into the Home Lab again. We'd click on the roles and we create a new role. So I'll give it the key as something like normal, as opposed to an admin, and they'll get the display name of normal, and they'll be in the group of normal user. And then when we click save, we should now be able to go back to the home page, grant the user, so we'll click Jim, we'll search for a project, Home Lab, click continue, and then we can grant this user the normal role, and then we can hit save. So now Jim is a normal user on the application of Portainer. And then obviously those roles can be configured to do different things. So give them different levels of access, different complexities of password, maybe even different authentication mechanisms. You can really configure this how you want. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you've got everything you need now to get this spun up within your environment and maybe plug in some of your applications. As I said, if you get this working with other applications that aren't on their website, do submit the documentation. The guys are really friendly on their Discord. I really like where this project is heading, and I think they've got a bright future ahead of them. I will be coming back to Zitadel in future videos because I'm really keen to see as they add new features and new applications, and who knows, I might even integrate this into my Kubernetes Home Lab. So as always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.